My name is Kent Marts, and I was born in Clarksville, Arkansas in 1963. My parents were Don and Pat Marts, and those are sort of which one's the mother and which one's the father, because it could be D-A-W-N, but it's Don, D-O-N Marts. And he grew up in Kansas and Oklahoma. And my mother is a Guthrie, a G-U-T-H-A-R-Y Guthrie, out of Logan and Gentry. And she grew up in Benton County and had met my dad while at the College of the Ozarks in Clarksville, and they got married, and there came me and my brother.
Tell me about where you grew up and what it was like.
Growing up in Clarksville was, it's a long time ago, and it was sort of an idyllic, 1960s childhood. Mom made us go outside and stay outside until she called us in for supper, and we could stay out past when the street lights went off until Dad whistled. And the rule was, as long as we could hear him whistle, we could be outside, and had a window air conditioning unit in their bedroom, and that was it. And Clarksville down in the River Valley, it's hot in the summertime, and we went barefoot and rode bicycles all over town, and it was a wonderful way to grow up. A lot of freedom.
So tell me, how did you end up in Benton County?
So my dad owned the Clarksville Herald-Democrat, and so I grew up in the newspaper business and went to the university for 2 years, and then transferred to the University of Arkansas, and then transferred to Arkansas State and got my journalism degree, and went to work out of college for the Win Progress and Shoppers News in Win, Arkansas. And then a job came open at the Benton County Daily Record, then the Benton County Daily Democrat, and I called Jim Hall on a Sunday morning. My parents heard about the job from the Springdale editor, Jim Morris. They saw each other Saturday night, and Morris said, have Kent call this guy tomorrow. They have a job coming open. And I was prepared to take a job at the Carroll County newspaper, and called Jim and said, yeah, Jim Morris said I need to call you, and I need to do a job interview with you. I'd love to come interview. And he says, well, it's not even open yet. And I said, well, I understand that, but I would like to interview today. And he says, well, you need to be here Monday. And I said, I can't. I have to be back in Win to cover a story at 6 o'clock, and I need to interview you before noon. And he's like, okay, meet you at the paper at 11. And he hired me. He said anybody that had the guts to call the editor of a newspaper at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, knowing that it was a Saturday, it was a morning newspaper on Sunday, and then basically demand an interview that morning, would probably make a good reporter. And he hired me, and I started in February of '86, and took the job here, obviously, instead of Carroll County, and worked in the newspaper business here until, what was it, September or October of 2017, when I got promoted out of the industry, which is my way of saying I was laid off.
So what was it like when you started? Where were you officed, and what did you do?
So we were officed in a two-story house just northwest of the square called the Bain House, and there's a business in there now, I think, but it's right under the water tower. It's where the newspaper was, and I started out as the education reporter. And I started on, I think it was a Tuesday night or a Tuesday, and just sort of sat around that morning because it was an afternoon paper. And Sonia Redwine, who had been covering the school, gave me a list of all the school board members and a description of them. And I went to the school board member meeting that night and wrote a story, and immediately had a Freedom of Information Act conflict right off the bat. They went into executive session, and I knew how many people there were on the school board, and the superintendent, I think the number was 10, and we're in the old cafeteria at Old High, and there's just a classic row of windows, and I walk by and I sort of happen to count because I don't know anybody, and there's 11 people in there, and I'm like, oh golly. And I walked back in, and they said, we're in executive session. I said, no, you're not, because there should be 10 people in here and there's 11, and I don't know who it is, but I'm sitting down. And they're like, no. And this person stood up and said, well, I'm the school attorney, and I'm going to be here to make sure they follow the law. And I said, okay. And I sat down. And they said, you need to leave. And I said, not until he leaves. And so he walked out with me, and it was, and he said, well, he explained it. He says, well, we've got this agreement with the paper that we can do that. And I said, they didn't tell me about that. And I thought, great, I'm going to go in tomorrow morning, I'm going to get fired. And went in, they called and talked to him, and Jim Hall had never heard of it. And the next morning, I wrote my story and didn't get fired. And next school board meeting, there was 10 people in that room instead of 11. So I really thought, I'm right off the bat, I'm going to get fired. And, didn't. It's just do your job. That's what it comes down to. No, do your job.
So after you kind of drew that line in the sand over the Freedom of Information Act, did that change the way they treated you after that?
I think they realized that it was, just follow the law. Nobody ever said a word to me about it. No school board member ever said a word to me about it. The superintendent didn't say a word about it. The attorney didn't say a word about it.
What about county government? When did you get involved covering county government?
So I never really directly covered county government. I mean, I would pinch hit for people who were on, vacation or tied up with something else. I'd cover things. But a little bit more history. I was the education reporter, the photographer, went to the Weekly Vista before it was owned by the Benton County Daily Record company, and then came back as the Bella Vista reporter. I was the business reporter, assistant managing editor, and the managing editor in 1995. And so from 1995 until 2012 or whatever it was, I was the managing editor of the Daily Record, and edited every single story, and talked to the reporters about what's going on and how do you cover it and things like that. So my involvement was guiding stories, talking to reporters about what is the news, how are we going to present it and things like that. And so it's all sort of secondhand, but it was from a ringside seat.
So tell me, what were the issues from 95 to 17?
The drudgery is not the news, right? The drudgery is not the news. A couple of things stand out. And the things that stand out are one incident in particular. Andy Lee was sheriff, and Andy Lee, was a great guy and a lightning rod, and people loved to make up stories about him, right? And it was always fun because I'd sit there and go, "Really, the photographer did that?" And they go, "Yeah," and I say, "Oh, yeah, I took that picture," and they don't know what to say because it's like that's not how it happened. People would embellish and make up. They'd love to do that. But Andy Lee was a lightning rod, and he was at a quorum court meeting campaigning for money, right? More money. Gotta have more money. And one of the quorum court members, they said he leaned back and took a big sigh, reached up, took his hearing aids out of his ears, set them down on the table in front of him, just crossed his arms and just sat there just smiling. And the point being, not going to listen to a word you say. And this JP was absolutely hard of hearing, right? And he just didn't care. And the other thing that strikes me is, I don't want to call it dysfunction, but in the 80s and 90s, the quorum court members felt like they were elected to represent, and they are elected to represent their constituents. But what that meant was the committee structure didn't work, because they'd appoint 3 people to a committee to study whatever it is, right? And the committee would come back with a recommendation. Well, the other members of the quorum court really couldn't take their recommendation because they hadn't done the research and had input. And so the committee structure for a long time was, it was everything that happened would be rehashed. The committee would spend weeks and months studying, calling people in, studying, come up with a decision and a recommendation, and then at least a few, and sometimes a lot of the other members of the quorum court would have the field be driven to reinvent that wheel, and couldn't just take the recommendation of the committee and go, okay, ask a couple of quick questions and then make a motion to accept the recommendation and do whatever. Couldn't do it. And that just drug things out and made it agony, for reporters, for the quorum court members, for the public. It just drew things out.
So who are some of the JPs that stand out over the years?
Dwayne Neal, and I didn't know this question was coming, but the first one is Dwayne Neal. Dwayne was a great guy that really handled business and took care of things. I'm trying to think other JPs. There's been so many. All right, here's a story about not maybe JPs, but about JPs. Back when the woodpecker thing, the Lord Godbird thing was happening. They thought they found the woodpecker over in the Eastwoods, and so we would interview JP candidates for endorsements. And this one candidate, I do not remember his name, came in, and why have you ever been? And we standard questions: have you ever been to a quorum court meeting? And well, why did you go? And have you ever been to a quorum court meeting? No. Why are you running for quorum court? Because of the woodpecker. Huh? And it's like, well, I don't want the federal government to take everybody's land, for the woodpecker over in East Arkansas. We're going, we're not in East Arkansas. Well, yes, but it's important that the quorum court fight for people's rights. And, and it was just like, okay. Yeah, and there's always those people who have never been to a quorum court meeting, who don't know what the quorum court does, has never talked to a JP before, but somebody or something makes them want to get on the quorum court. And some of them get on the quorum court, and some of them get off the quorum court for whatever reason. So, of all the JPs, probably Dwayne Neal, just a likable guy. Was open, would talk to you, would not, was level-headed. But Dwayne's the one guy I remember. And I'm trying to, there's a lot of JPs a long time ago.
Talk about the judges you remember.
Oh, the judges. So, Judge Norwood was the county judge when I started, and everybody had respect for him. I mean, it was just, he was just a solid, JP, county judge. Bruce Rutherford, had known Bruce Rutherford. Bruce Rutherford was a big man. He's a former deputy sheriff, and then later became an investigator for the prosecutor's office. But Bruce Rutherford was just a big man. Every judge has their controversies, and he's still alive, and I don't want to bring up old things, but there's always, we all do stupid stuff sometimes. I raise my right hand and volunteer. Yes, indeed, I have done stupid things in my past. Let's see, other county judges. Bruce Rutherford, a story about Bruce Rutherford when he was deputy. He made a traffic stop, and 3 big old boys jump out of the car and over, it's just north of Garfield, where that beekeeper supply is now. And right in there, he pulls them over. They all get out, and they start just attacking. And so he's got one of them, and he gets him in a chokehold, and the other guy comes up, and he's on top of him, hitting him in the top of the head. He's on his back, hitting him in the top of his head. The other guy comes out with a gun, and he's like choking his brother in an arm lock, and has the guy on top of his head, beating him, giving him noogie bumps on his head. And the other guy's with a gun going, he said, go ahead, shoot your brother. And he said, he tried to get around me, and he said, I'd just move around. And a state trooper pulls up, and Bruce is sitting there going, help me, get him off of me. And the state trooper, and I talked to the state trooper, he said, I was laughing so hard I couldn't do anything. He said, Bruce was just, he said, finally, when I pull up, the guy with the gun takes off, and he says that guy's on top of him, still hitting him, and the guy finally chokes out, and he lays him down, and the trooper said he reached up with one hand and pulled him off his back and just started beating him into the side of the car, you know. And it's back in the days when you can do silly things like that and get away with it and not be sued for it. So, you know, they all had, you know, they got us to where we are today. You know, they all got us to where we are today. So.
Let's talk about the growth. Do you remember when they were planning and looking at projections and they were saying, hey, this is going to really grow?
You know, when I moved to Benton County in 1986, and if memory serves, to Bentonville in 1986, if memory serves, the population of Benton County was like 8,400 people, okay? And there was a year in the early 80s where Bentonville, the city of Bentonville, issued 2 building permits for houses. Only one of those was built. It's like 82 or 83, something like that. And only one house was built in Bentonville. Centerton's population was 317, if I remember correctly. And, you know, now Bentonville's, what, 45,000 or something like that, and Centerton's 10,000. You know, and the projections just, you couldn't predict this, right? There was never any way to start to even in the 90s when it really started taking off, you just couldn't ever predict. The growth always exceeded predictions, you know, which put all of the municipalities, which puts the county all behind the curve, right? And you just can't. We build infrastructure for today. You can't, in Arkansas at least, we don't have the mechanism in place, so that for whatever reason, to predict and build big roads for the future. Right? It's like I-49. It was 2 lanes. It should have been built 3 right off the bat. You know how much money we would have saved if I-49 would have been built 3 lanes with 3-lane bridges and built for the future? You know, I can remember going up to Kansas City in the 90s. My wife's grandmother lived in Olathe, and we'd go up for Thanksgiving or Christmas. And there would be these big 3-lane, you know, 3 lanes each direction boulevard with big medians going out through farmland for miles. And no houses. And now there's houses everywhere. They were building for the future. They were anticipating growth. And it just doesn't, for whatever happens, I think the reason is, you know, Arkansas's population is what, 3.2 million or something like that? You know, Missouri has 2 population centers that are bigger than that. You know, and Missouri has, like, at one point 6 times the population and only 3 times the land mass or something like that. So it's just a numbers game. We don't have enough people to pay for that kind of infrastructure. And here, you may have enough people, but you can't get ahead of the curve fast enough. And it's always a challenge to see the future, you know, because you don't want to overbuild. And I think there's that fear intrinsically of being accused of overspending money, because, you know, it doesn't matter what you do, somebody says you shouldn't spend the money. And you know that. It's a very common occurrence, sadly, for people to criticize, you know, for building a school building. You know, it's human nature, I think, to just criticize people for spending money.
Sure. And, well, what about the growth of the sheriff's office? I mean, I know you've seen huge growth.
Oh,
there.
Huge growth. Yeah, you know, it used to be, you know, the jail right over here. I mean, you know, it's a tiny little thing, and it was a dungeon. I mean, it truly was a dank, not pleasant place to be. And a lot of people will say that's good. And to that I'll say, and this is the liberal part of me coming out, I guess, is like over half the people in the jail are there only because they can't pay the money to bond out, right? And so if you're keeping them in jail and depriving them of their freedom because they don't have money to pay or don't want to bail out, right? And so I think that creates a situation that exacerbates, there's a 50-cent word for you, exacerbates the crowding in the system. You know, there's people in jail, they can bail out with $500, but they don't, or they can't, and so they're sitting there and we're having to pay for them. And we have to build more bunkhouses and get more jailers. I've got a couple of friends that are jailers. And, you know, the conditions are far better now than they were, you know, a long time ago when the jail just right over here, you know, behind the old courthouse building. Since been torn down, a new building built on it. But, you know, population of 75, you know, and now there's 700 or 800 people in the county jail. It's, you know, and they're just, you know, it's just, well, a big old warehouse, you know, and in most cases, they're in bunk rooms and off they go. Now, it's been a long time since I've been in the New County Jail, but can't call it new anymore. It's been there for decades, but.
Do you have any more Andy Lee stories? You talked about Sheriff Lee earlier.
I can talk about lots of Andy Lee stories.
What are some of the ones that stand out?
Okay, this is a newspaper, direct newspaper, couple of direct newspaper related ones. There was the old courthouse, and then just east of it was the county jail, and there was an alley. And they were, there's a big manhunt for a guy named Don Davis who killed a woman in Rogers. And he broke into the house and shot her with a 44, older lady, Mrs. Daniels. And shot her with a 44 Magnum, and she was preparing her breakfast or a meal, and it was oatmeal, I think it was, and the guy that killed her ate the breakfast and put a cigarette out in the bowl, and they ended up figuring out who it was, and there was a manhunt going on, and we're all standing out by the jail just talking, you know, and pretty sure it was this, I'm sure it was Don Davis. And so we're sitting there, and managing editor at the time was Kay Brockwell, and her husband was a deputy sheriff, Rocky. And we're standing there, and we hear on the radio that there's been this guy spotted at this house. Somebody calls in. Well, it was just out here on Sugar Creek Road, just northeast of Bentonville. And so Andy gets in the car. Kay gets in the passenger seat and shuts the door. And Andy's like, "Get out." And he says, "I won't. Get out, I won't." And so he drove up to the scene, and Kay's in the car. We should have jumped in the back seat too, but Kay was the only one of the mind to just do it. And whoever it was, Kay jumps out and gets a great picture of Andy Holt drawn down on this guy. And you know, people say, "Oh, he took her with her and staged the whole thing." It's like, no, that's not how it happened. There was a wreck up here on County Road 40, McNally Road, and a car had run off the road and gone through like it was a flower planter or something, big, you know, flower bed, and flipped over. And Bella Vista Fire Department rolls up, and I get there, and Andy's there because Andy would go on calls, and they're working to get him out of the car, and they're both dead, right? And they're get one out and start CPR, and there's one ambulance and 2 or 3 firefighters, and they pull, and Bentonville's on the way, they pull the other person out and throw him on a gurney, and there's nobody else. And so Andy sits there and starts doing CPR because there was not enough manpower. I mean, had there not been people there, I would have started CPR, right? I mean, I'm not going to sit there, even as a journalist, I'm not going to sit there and let somebody die, right? I'm going to put my camera down, I'm going to try and save their life if I have to, which I did on a number of occasions. And I take a picture of Andy doing CPR, because a picture of the sheriff doing CPR on this guy is a whole lot more interesting than just the paramedics whose job it is, right? I mean, that's their job. Andy doesn't have to do this. He's doing it. We're in the picture in the paper. Well, once again, Andy staged that. He pushed the paramedics out of the way so he could do CPR, and he had the photographer take his picture. Oh, really? Really? Yeah. You know who the photographer was? No. That was me. That's not how it happened. You know, and there's things like that. It's just, you know, on and on. But Andy was a character. He knew how to push people's buttons. You know, at the quorum court, he knew what, and you know, but he didn't really care. You know, and Andy's died, so God rest his soul. He can't defend himself against anything here. But you know, there was always accusations. He was injured and had a medical retirement from the Washington D.C. Police Department. But you know, he sure was able to function as the sheriff pretty well. And there was always controversy about that, and people, you know, said, "Oh, he was really a tow truck driver, and you know, not a policeman." And it was just. And the records were in storage, and the Washington, D.C. Police Department wouldn't pull them without a court order, and just on and on and on. So, you know, just this aura of him, you know, being, you know, this protagonist in many ways. Yeah.
So you're saying he essentially got, even though he was kind of a character, he got a bad rap on some things?
Oh, yeah. Now, were there fair criticisms of him? Absolutely. You know, we can all be criticized. There's two sides to every story, Scott, and you know that. I mean, you've been there. Some sides are stronger than others, but, you know, it was just, people love a good conspiracy theory, right? Okay? We see on social media all the time, the truth dies before the gate opens. You know, it's a horse race, and whoever gets out of the gate, whoever gets the first step out of the gate the farthest, wins, whether you're right or wrong. And you know, a good conspiracy theory story is just people love it. You know, it's like when they see a picture of Mars and there's a thing that looks like a door. Oh, there's a doorway on Mars. NASA inadvertently released that picture. It's 10 centimeters tall. It's not a door, it's a shadow. But it just, people love to speculate, right? And it's conspiracy theory stuff. So there was always some conspiracy theory surrounding Andy Lee, which made for good newspaper fodder, most assuredly. You know, and election time. Jiminy, I loved election times, you know, in the weeks leading up to election and election night. You know, there was few things. I mean, it was really enjoyable to sit there and plan out who's covering what, pre-write your stories. So, you know, in the race for JP District 6, blank defeated blank, blah, 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 by a total of blank. So all you have to do is plug in those stories. And we'd produce 40 or 50, you know, 8, 10-inch stories on election night. And it was always really a good feeling to get that done and be able to execute a plan very well. But there was always, and this leads me down to a question you haven't asked. There was always a problem with the election count. When I started, literally, the county clerk had a big chalkboard, and she would write numbers in on the chalkboard as they came in. And, you know, that was always fun. And then they went to the punch card system, which I still believe is probably the best voting system out there, is a punch card system, despite the people in Florida who couldn't execute a punch card. But, you know, the count would be delayed because somebody put a soda pop tab in the ballot box. And when they were pulled out, they didn't catch it. And so the soda pop tab ran through the counting machine and goobered it up. And so we'd have to wait for hours and hours and days sometimes for that ballot box to get fully counted so the election was completely done. But, you know, over the years, there's been a lot of criticism of the election commission because they just, you know, it was just agony, you know, beyond belief, trying to get 3-4 days sometimes. And you'd see Washington County, they'd be done by 10 o'clock, and Benton County would be up here a day and a half later still trying to get the ballots counted. And, you know, but all those, and there again were conspiracy theories around what was going on. Oh, they're doing that so they can change the punches and stuff. And it's like, they're doing the best they can. Go down and watch, but there's always a good conspiracy theory, and there's always fodder. But why did I not like, or why I loved leading up to elections? 4 days before the election, the phone would ring and say, "Hey, I've got some information about Andy Lee." "Oh, you do? What is it?" "Oh, well, why didn't you tell us about it a month ago?" "Oh, well, I didn't think it was important until just now." "Okay, well, guess what? We're not running it. You're trying to manipulate the system 5 days. Now, if they had some viable information, yeah, but if you're just somebody out there just trying to stir the pot, no, we're not going to do that. 4 days before the election, nobody's going to have time to rebut. We're just not going to do it. We did a few of them after the elections, but, and that happened to everybody. It wasn't just Andy Lee. I just use his as the example. There'd always be people call up about random 2 or 3 candidates for whatever office, from JP to state senator. All this stuff going on social media right now, it's not a new thing in social media where they come up with something right before the election. It's been going on since the first election ever held had that problem. Somebody trying to talk bad about somebody right before the election. So here's the interesting story. Dave Bisbee, just now thought about this, and County Judge Dave Bisbee. We called him, set up an interview, and for the editorial board at the paper, and he said he wasn't going to come in. He didn't need it. He wasn't going to waste the time and come in for it. And he said, and this quote echoes to a quote that's President Trump said. He said, "I could get caught with a boy in a ditch, and I'm going to get elected county judge." And it's like, no, not a boy, a goat. I could get caught in a ditch with a goat, and I'm going to be elected county judge. Which harkens forward to, President Trump. I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I'm still going to get elected judge. But Dave Bisbee was a good county judge, had a builder's background, and brought some, really strong, sort of that kind of mindset to it. Now, here's another one, newspaper related, with the county judge, Gary Black. So if my standard shift pickup truck slipped into neutral one night and rolled down the driveway, it would have rolled across the street and down Gary Black's driveway and run into his kitchen. Okay, I lived across the street from the county judge. And his administration had a lot of conflicts and stuff, and we had to endorse somebody, and so we gave him, and the words were, our scathing endorsement. I had to live across the street from the county judge after we wrote a scathing endorsement, and he was less than pleased by that, but we continued to get along, and when he moved, to some land he owned out on northeast Benton County, I helped him. He had picked up rocks over the years and had lined his driveway with fieldstones, and I helped him pick up rocks a couple of times, and we were, good friends. Now I'm getting ready to build a house out there, and he stopped and talked a couple of times, and he has a good laugh now about it, about that. So it was still painful for a little while, though, to have to live across the street from the guy that you gave a scathing endorsement to.
So
yeah.
How was he as judge?
Oh, Gary was, you tend to forget, you remember the extremes, right? And the reality is you remember generally the bad extremes and don't really do the good extremes. Gary brought a businessman's attitude. He had worked for Walmart and Sam's Club for years. He brought sort of a businessman's attitude, and he hired good people around him, which frankly is, many successful people use that strategy to their advantage, and I think it's a wise strategy. Hire people that are good at what they do, train them, and let them get out of the way. I took that attitude at the newspaper. I'd try and hire the best people I could find, but yet we're open to training and doing things. And Gary Black did a good job of managing a lot of stuff, right? Building roads. And then there was, I'm not going to do that. It's it's all in the newspapers if people want to go back and read all those words. There's stories there, but I have a hard time talking about people who how do I want to say it? I don't want to remember people for the bad things they did, right? Now, it's not a case of, remember Mussolini because he made the trains run on time, right? I mean, at that level, you remember the people for the bad things they did, right? Don Davis, he may have been a great charitable person, but he shot Jane Daniel in the head with a .44 Magnum, right? You remember those people. There's been a lot of interesting characters come through the courtrooms of Benton County over the years, just do crazy stuff in court. One guy stands up and starts singing. I don't remember what the song was as a hymn, and then Judge Keith, I believe, was presiding at the trial or the hearing, and he goes running across the courtroom and tries to dive through the window from the second story and to escape. And that would have been a beautiful plan, except windows are bulletproof glass. And he went bonk off of the glass, just Tracy Neal would be an interesting, if you could get Tracy to talk, because he's been here 20 years covering court system the entire time. Tracy has some astoundingly fun stories.
What are some of the court cases that you remember that stand out?
The murder trials. At the newspaper, each murderer gets a nickname to remember them by, right? It's easy because and there was like the Glump Glump killer. I don't remember his name, but he was fishing with a friend over on Spavinaw Creek around Gravett somewhere, and he got mad at him and ran over him with the car. But that wasn't good enough, so he backed up and ran over him again and then ran over him again. So we nicknamed him the Glump Glump killer. There's the drive-back-by killer out here east of Rogers, and this involved Andy Lee. It was over east of the Rogers Airport, and their TV cameras are interviewing Andy, and Andy's facing the highway, so like the highway's back behind where you are. And the cameras are right here talking to Andy, and he's describing, the killer, because out in the county, so he's holding a press conference, and he says he's driving a pickup truck with blah, 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 just like that one right there. And then he brakes and runs and jumps in his car, pulls the guy over, and it was the murderer he had driven back by, so he became known as the drive-back-by killer. Gee, Christmas. Trials where multiple people would try to bring guns in the courtroom and get caught. This is before metal detectors. There's an old story about one of the county judges, and one of the circuit judges. I can't remember who it was. This is back in like the 40s. Said, it's come to my attention that there's a man in this courtroom with a gun, and if you bring it up here right now, I'm not going to do anything. And so 5 people or 6 people stood up, and he goes, well, that's very interesting, but the person I know has a gun still hadn't stood up. And a couple more people stood up and walked up there, and he confiscated their guns and went on with the trial. Now you know what would happen if that today? They'd all go to jail, prison. It'd just be ugly. But it was a different time and a different way of doing things. I think some other interesting things in court. There just gets to be so many of them.
What about some of the ones we've talked to have talked about David Klinger.
David Klinger.
Said he was a really good prosecutor.
He was a really good prosecutor, a good judge. But I was at a couple of stories about David. He would tend to rock in his chair, and if he was in his office, the TV cameras would be in there in the office, right? And he'd be sitting here rocking. And so they were all trying to keep him framed up, so all the TV people would be rocking with him, right? And all of a sudden he'd go and stop, and they'd keep going a couple of times. And so their video was always just terrible. And there was one time that I'm sitting at the end of his table, because we were all just up around this table, and he's over here, and the cameras and radios, and they've all just put their microphones right here, right? And I'm sitting there. I'll use these 2 pens, just happen to be sitting here. A couple ink pens. And I have my notebook here, and I'm taking notes. And I look down, and I see all those microphones, and I just start going, just like that, just tapping my pencil right in front of their right in front of their microphones. And they were so mad at me because they didn't have any audio, and and it's just sabotage. They'd take my camera bag. I'd go to pull a flash out. My flash was gone. One of the TV reporters had stolen it and put it somewhere else. They'd always give it back, but there was this competition and camaraderie between TV and radio to get stuff. And just everybody has that. When I worked in a welding shop, they'd set off balloons full of not full, but a little balloon. They'd light off a balloon right behind you full of oxyacetylene, make a big old boom, try and scare you. It's hazing to a certain point. But David was real solid. He was really an upstanding, square guy. He was pretty dry. He would, at one point he had never lost a case. And the reality is, he never lost a case, not because he was so good, but because he would only go to trial with cases that, by golly, he was going to win. Right? That's why he never lost any cases, because if it was a marginal case, he didn't go to trial. He'd plea it out or just let it go. If it was minor enough, he'd just let it go, and just not going to prosecute. That's how he maintained that great record of never losing a case. Is that he won cases that he could win, right? And as a judge, he was, good judge, never any controversy. Another judge, Tom Keefe. Tom Keefe was an old newspaper guy, right? And so he had an affinity, and would eat lunch over here at the cafe, or the filling station cafe on the square. And all the lawyers and judges, that was the place. It was the only close restaurant. People just walk across the street. And one day there was a trial going on, and I'm covering that trial, and don't remember what the trial was, but I was having lunch with Judge Keefe, and he leaned over and he said, and God rest his soul, he's dearly departed too. He leaned over and he says, this afternoon when Scott Davis gets up, he's going to say this. And I don't remember who the attorney was, but he had a peculiar speech pattern and, a cadence. And Tom mimicked him, not in an offensive way, but he said, here's what he's going to say and how he's going to say it. So and he gavels the trial back in session. And of course, I'm on the front row, dead center, right? And I'm taking notes, and he gets up and he starts talking. And he's saying exactly what Tom Keefe said he was going to say. Exactly the exact same way. And I'm sitting there, and he gets done, and I look up, just like this. I didn't wear glasses then, but I just look up, and Tom makes eye contact with me, and he goes, 5 minutes, and he walks out, because when we made eye contact, he busted a gut. He just started laughing as hard as he could, had to cover it with a cough, and ran out of his room. And after the trial, the day ended, he sort of made eye contact with me and told me, hey, go to my office. Walked in there, he shut the door, and he says, I about wet my pants. He said, when I looked at you, he says, I just couldn't hold it anymore. You remember good stories like that, it just becomes a blur of so much stuff, that is over, 30 years. There's just so many goofy things that happen. I wish I would have written them all down, and things that happened in the newsroom, and decisions that were made and how they were made, fascinating stories
What are some of the hard, tough decisions you had to make over your editorial lives?
Scathing editorial for the guy that lives across the street from you, right? For news coverage, one very difficult decision, David Frank Dempsey, a photographer at the newspaper, there'd been in an apartment complex in the north side of Rogers, a truck, car, kid left in the car, parent ran inside, is in the middle of winter, kid knocked it into neutral, rolled back down, went through a fence and down into a pond and sank, right? And so the call comes in, they're over there, the kid's been in the water for a pretty good amount of time. And they find the body, and you take pictures of everything, right? You just take pictures because you always not publish them. But David kept shooting, and a firefighter reached up to hand the body, because it was a pretty good drop off, and firefighter in gear, pants and shirt, is handing this, I don't know, baby, toddler, I don't remember the age, small kid, up, and David stops taking pictures. And the guy falls because he says, I'm not taking pictures of that body, I'm just not doing it. And the guy slips and falls in the mud, and David starts taking pictures, and the bodies start to come up out of the water, but still covered with water, and you can't see, you can tell it's a body, but you can't see facial features or anything else. And it was a fantastic picture, gut-wrenching, and I couldn't decide what to do, and it was 50-50. And the baseball board was having sign-ups across the street effectively. So this would have been in probably February. And I said, I'm going to take it over there and ask them, because they're not inside, just see. And there was, I don't know, 5 men and 5 women there roughly. And I showed the picture, and the 5 men said, no, don't run it. All 5 of the women said, you have to run that picture. And so we ran the picture. And I was prepared for the storm. A couple of phone calls. That was it. It was such a powerful picture that, it went. Decisions like that are very hard. There was a case in Rogers where 2 men had taken a 13-year-old and kept him overnight and abused him. And he died from positional asphyxiation. And the details in the trial were horrifying. And this is sort of emblematic of a lot of sex abuse and child abuse cases. How do you convey what happened without describing what happened? And so on this one particular one, I don't remember the guy's names, both life prison, and we had a nickname for it. I won't even say the nickname, for it to be recorded. But a person calls up and says, you're just running the most vile, disgusting stuff just to make people read it. I'm like, no, sir, we're not. And I said, okay, tell you what, I've got, the transcript from the Rogers Police Department interview. I said, I'm going to start flipping it. Can you hear me flip it? He said, yeah. I said, okay, you say stop. And I start flipping it, and he says stop, and I open it. I said, I'm just going to start reading from the top of the page. And I start reading from the top of the page. And miraculously, he stopped on a page that was one of the worst segments. And I got about 250 words in. He says, I'm really sorry to bother you for your time, and hung up. Because how do you convey that? I mean, you can't. It's things that you don't want to ever have to read or talk about, but yet it happens. And how do you convey that? That's difficult decisions to do. Decisions that happen in this room, great, you're right about it. You're right about the conflicts and go on. That's easy. It may be controversial, it may make people mad. That's not hard decisions. But decisions like that, stuff like that's hard. There was a drowning over on Beaver Lake off of somebody's dock. And the press release had a mixed address. And we're going to run the address. And so I call, and we look on a property map, and it's either Kent Marts or Scott Davis. And so I pick Scott Davis, and I call up, and I mean, because we want to get it right. Mr. Davis, Kent Marts with the Benton County Daily Record. You know, I know there was a drowning out there. We're just trying to confirm, was it off of your dock or your neighbor's dock? And he's like, God, it was off my dock. You know how hard it is to make that call? Knowing that you're have a 50-50 chance of calling the person who the drowning happened off their dock? Well, and then he starts talking, right? I didn't call to get any information other than confirm. But I said, sir, you don't have to talk to me. He's like, no, that's okay. And I get a much better story out of that. You got to make the phone calls. You know, you got to not be afraid to make the phone calls. You have to not be afraid to run difficult stories. Don O'Neill, mayor of Bentonville. His mother was the first person who touched me. His mother caught me when I slid into home, right? When I was born, the moment I was born, his mama caught me. Family friend, you know, and he was convicted of non-feasance of office and removed as the mayor of Bentonville because of reporting we did. You know how hard that is? You know how hard that is to do? And that's the hard part, is those decisions like that. And having my kids, I told them, if you ever do anything, it will be on the front page of the newspaper. If you get accused of a crime, it's going to run on the front page of the paper. Nobody else's will for doing that, but yours is going to. And it was a pretty strong tool because they believed me, because they knew I'd do it. So, Josephine Highland, county clerk. You know, you remember people for the bad stuff. Josephine was a wonderful person. But if you were an attorney and you wanted to have something filed immediately, you paid a fee that she didn't put in a cigar box. At the end of the month, she distributed it out to her clerks how she saw fit. And that was all well and good, but it turned out to be illegal. And the Benton County Daily Record, at that time the Benton County Daily Democrat, and then the Rogers Morning News both reported that story. And it was a hard story to report because she was well liked. And she ended up getting removed from office. And, you know, hard things to do when you are reporting on people's weak sides that are very, very well liked. Do you ignore it? Well, you can. But what else do you ignore then? You know? If I'm going to ignore a Walmart VP's DWI, then why am I going to run anybody's DWI? You know? So pretty soon, what's getting reported? Nothing. Right? So this has turned into sort of a newspaper interview. But, you know.
Let me ask one thing before I forget. There was a big change over the years, and you may have missed part of it because it happened maybe before, but what do you remember about the switch from blue to red in Benton County, since Benton County kind of led the state?
Right. You know, at one time, when I got here, in '86, every single elected official was a Democrat. Every single one, except maybe David Klinger. There was one, I think David Klinger may have been the first Republican elected at the county level, although it's technically a judicial district and carries, it was at that time the 19th, the stupid stuff I can remember, the 19th judicial district of Carroll and Benton counties. And so he got elected to that. Now, if I remember correctly, David Klinger was the first Republican at a countywide level to carry a vote. And, you know, it was just slow. You know, it'd be one other person and then one more person. And it's a pendulum. Life is a pendulum. You know, everything is going to change. You know, it was all Democrat and it swung to all Republican. And at some point, it's going to swing back. It's just nature of the beast. You know, nothing is static. Everything's going to change. And, you know, we didn't really cover that as an event. I don't remember anybody, you know, TV, radio, or news covering that as, you know, 5% of the elected offices in Benton County are now Republican. 13% are now Republican. There was none of that. It was just part of, you know, just, it'd be interesting to go back and chart that. You know, that'd be an interesting research project, to go back, look at all of the elections, and track that change and see from election to election how that percentage went. That'd be an interesting thing to do.
Are quorum court meetings, are they partisan in any way, really?
Nah. You know, I honestly think a quorum court, personal belief, there's no reason for a quorum court to be Republican or Democrat. It's irrelevant to the cause. It's just platform politics at the county level, at the quorum court level. You know, I just don't see it coming into play. You know, are you a fiscal conservative, fiscal liberal? You know, I mean, if we're going to wear labels, you know, that's basically what a party affiliation is now, whether you're conservative or liberal. And I guess that helps a little bit for people to decide which party you're going to register with and run for. But but there's no blood test. You know, there's no litmus test to prove that you're a Democrat or to prove that you're a Republican. If you've never run for office and never done anything, you just walk in and say I'm a Republican, congratulations, you're a Republican. But I just, you know, it doesn't really come into that. Like, municipal governments are not party affiliation. You know, you don't run as a Republican or Democrat when you run for a municipal office in Arkansas. So, you know, I think clearly through signage and messaging, people are, and in fact, I see people sometimes run, you know, for municipal office saying whether they're Republican or Democrat for obviously trying to get votes, is my guess. I mean, because look, if you're going to run, you want to win, right? And so it's not important. Arkansas has deemed it not important at this municipal level, and I personally don't see it as a necessity or requirement to be on the quorum court, to be one party affiliation or another. But the reality is, in Benton County today, if you run as a Democrat, congratulations, you're going to come in second. Yeah.
Are there any other stories you can think of maybe that I haven't thought to ask about, or things that stand out?
You know, with time, there's a bunch out there. Let me think. You know, I think the best story is Mary Jane Clemmer, who was a reporter for the Benton County Daily Record, Benton County Democrat at the time, coming back and telling that story, and I wish I could remember what his name was, taking out his hearing aids so he didn't have to listen to Andy Lee ask for more money. You know, it's just a classic, you know, a classic story. You know, it's just, they get the job done. It may take longer because they couldn't, I'm talking about historically, just couldn't let the committee structure work like it's intended. So, you know, at one point, in fact, they went away with the committee structure and had a committee of the whole. So for everything was normally if it had a committee to study how to repair the water pipes in this building, they had to appoint 3 people and go study and come make a recommendation. Well, they just couldn't do it. And so back in the 90s, they literally stopped having a committee structure, and the entire quorum court would meet as a committee and go over it to come back and make a recommendations to themselves on what they were going to do. Yeah. So is that dysfunction? No, they functioned. Maybe it might be malfunction or misfunction, but it's still function, right?
Here, if somebody who had never been to Benton County said, Kent, tell me about Benton County, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them a story. I have many friends who were forced to move here in the 80s and 90s by their large corporate employer, and we'll say from Cincinnati. And it's like, Scott, you're going down to work to be the rep for Walmart, and it's a 2-year assignment. And it's like, okay, I know I got to go. Well, 2 years starts coming rolling around, and they call and say, hey, look, I know that Kent's getting ready to come down here and replace me, but my kids are in school, and look, and this is a true story based on a real true story. You know, but look, if you'll pay for a vacation to the islands, I'll stay here so Kent doesn't have to come down. And it'd be like, okay, yeah, we can do that. And so 2 years later, they call and say, hey, you know, hey, Scott, it's about time for you to come back to Cincinnati or Cleveland or wherever. And it's like, no, I'm not coming back. And it's like, no, yeah, you're coming back up here because we're going to give you blah, blah, blah. And we're going to send Kent down there. No, I'm not coming back. What do you mean you're not coming back? I'm quitting. If you make me come back, I'm going to quit. And those people still live in Benton County to this day because it's different. It's special. We have a great environment. We have great school systems. We have our problems, you know. I mean, I was watching live on Facebook back when all the deputy sheriffs marched out of the Benton County Courthouse with full riot gear on, a gas mask scurried down. And I said to my wife, there's going to be tear gas in less than 5 minutes. And there was. You know, we have our problems. Every family does. But, Scott, there are far worse places to live than Benton County, Arkansas. Far worse places to live.
One last question. If you had to complete this sentence, how would you say it? My favorite thing about Benton County is?
My favorite thing about Benton County is the variety of people, right? There are people from all over the world here. My wife is a kindergarten teacher. She's had kids who moved here speaking Korean, Afghani, Chinese, no English, very little English. You know, it's just, there are people here from around the world. And it's just, you know, just the people are what makes the place, right? Unless it's like the Buffalo River. And then the place makes the people. But, you know, this is, I don't know, it's just always been a little slice of really good pie.